I'm about to do what no married man should ever do with my wife here, which is to talk about marriage. Before I got married, for those of you who aren't, a friend told me a secret that I've held dear. He said the secret to having a happy marriage, a long marriage, a fulfilling relationship was really to be found in only 2 words: yes, dear. And I've used those 2 words on many occasions. It gets you out of more trouble than you can imagine. But those words don't represent all that I know about marriage, because I've taught courses about marriage here. I've written about marriage. I've researched the issue of marriage for many years now, more than a decade. So what I wanted to do today is to offer you 3 stories of marriage. 3 stories about the role of marriage in our society, how marriage is changing, and also some personal stories. These are tales that involve law, economics, and culture, and that suggest how these forces, these broad forces, can shape what we think of as the most intimate decisions of our lives, the most personal relationships in our lives. So, first story, how rising expectations have led to a decline in marriage. Let's start with some history. In 1950, not that long ago, it was actually illegal to have sex without being married. People did time for that. Much less were they permitted to live together without being married. Those rules were part of a broader web of legal rules that channeled people into marriage. They constrained sexuality, they limited their freedom. They made it so that it was only possible to have a life once one was married. One had to get married. There was really no choice about it, because marriage was the only setting within which you could have children, raise a family, have a partner. Now, of course, that world seems a distant memory. Marriage is a choice. As the necessity of marriage has declined, our expectations of marriage have increased. I see this change in my own family. So I have 3 older sisters, and we all want pretty much the same things in a partner. We want emotional fulfillment. We want psychological compatibility. We want someone who's going to make us feel alive. My one sister has been trying for 35 years now to meet her soulmate. That's what everyone wants. My father, though, is a man who was born in 1913. He had a much simpler calculus about marriage. He would ask my sisters 3 simple questions whenever a new suitor would come around. 1, does he drink? 2, does he work? And 3, is he violent? And those 3 simple questions, actually, if you had the right answer, then you had a winner in my father's eyes. This talk of compatibility and psychological understanding, that was foreign to my father, and it was foreign to other people of his era. Marriage then was an institution. Now it's become much more of a relationship. And we expect that relationship to bring us a level of joy and fulfillment that would have seemed odd to our grandparents. The change in expectations of marriage have profoundly reshaped marriage patterns. In 1950, marriage rates were about the same for the working class and the affluent. Right? Everybody got married, they married early, they had lots of kids. Now, of course, that's not the landscape. The rise in expectations of marriage have led to what is an unprecedented divergence in the marriage patterns, experience of marriage, by the college-educated and affluent on one hand, and by the less educated and economically disadvantaged on the other. College-educated people still get married, but they married later in life. Marriage for them is no longer a starting line, it's a finish line. It's a reward, it's an achievement. It's what you do when you've accomplished other things so that then you get to the point where you can enjoy the fruits of marriage. For the less educated, they seek the same thing, but because if they're economically disadvantaged, they're less able to realize the goals that they have for marriage. So more economically disadvantaged people are less likely to marry now, and when they do, they're more likely to divorce. Thus, we have the creation of 2 societies, in a sense, when it comes to marriage. A set of stable, more or less enduring marriages on one hand, and less stable or non-marriages on the other. But the issue throughout, to be clear, is not that people don't value marriage. Sometimes when people talk about marriage declining or people not getting married, they make it sound as though people just don't, care about marriage anymore. But in fact, that's wrong. Quite the opposite. People value marriage more than ever. Right? And the cultural primacy of marriage is nowhere more apparent, right, for anyone who reads the newspapers than in the debate about same-sex marriage. Right? In the debate about same-sex marriage in California and elsewhere, both sides emphasize the primacy of marriage. Right? One side says marriage is so special that we have to preserve it, and the other side says marriage is so special that we can't exclude anyone from it. Right? But they all agree on the specialness of marriage. The issue is that the bar, again, has risen so that the affluent can get over the bar, if perhaps later in life, but the disadvantaged have trouble clearing the bar. The decline in marriage is most extreme among African Americans. And this is one of the issues that brought me to this project. 7 in 10 adult black women are unmarried. 3 in 10 are likely to never marry. The central cause behind this is not deviant values, because African Americans value marriage as much as others. It's really what can only be described as a catastrophe that has befallen black men. The labor market has changed during our lifetime as a result of globalization, technology. The jobs that blue-collar men might have had 30 or 40 years ago, the jobs that men in my family had, jobs at Republic Steel in Cleveland, Ohio, where I grew up, or at the Ford Motor Company, or at Chrysler or GM, all these manufacturing jobs, those jobs then paid a living wage. More than that, they enabled one to support a family. Now those jobs either don't exist or they pay much less than they used to. The labor market has shifted in ways that have disadvantaged blue-collar workers in particular, blue-collar men in particular. At the same time that education has become more necessary for a good job, black men in particular have been left out. More than 50% of black boys less than 50% of black boys graduate from high school. Black boys are only half as likely as their female counterparts to graduate from college. There's twice as many black women as men graduate from college every year. Even the college fields that typically were dominated by men, computer science, engineering, business, in all of these fields, black men are, by some measures, few and far in between, far outnumbered by their female counterparts. So what happens to all of these men who don't make it through the educational system and who don't find a place in the economy? What does a society do with them? Well, many of them end up in jail. That's where we warehouse people for whom we don't have an economic use. Estimates are that 1 in 4 black men or more will spend some time in prison. We incarcerate more people not only than we ever have, but more than any country in the world. These are the elements of a social disaster. This undermines marriage undermines marriage for women of all economic categories. Even if you look at college-educated black women, they're twice as likely as their white counterparts not to be married. This leads to more than 7 in 10 black children being born to unmarried parents. And these issues, while I focused on African Americans, these issues are not limited to African Americans. We used to think they were, but they're not. If we look at young white women who have their first child in their early 20s, 60% of them are not married when they have that child. It's an extraordinary number. Now, I understand that single parents can be good parents, right? I was raised by a single parent for much of my childhood after my mother died. But the research confirms what intuition suggests, which is that 2 parents are better than 1. These inequalities, thus, then that we see in the family, these are inequalities that are a consequence of economic inequality in our society, but they also are a mechanism of that inequality. And if we don't intervene in that process in some way, those inequalities will perpetuate themselves across generations. The question of intervention is a tough one, right? Because we can't force people to get married. That's a hard one. But we can make education more available. We can bolster people's economic prospects. We can invest more directly in children so that children don't bear the burden of a family's difficulties. So that's story 1. Story 2 once again, starts with history. In 1970, only a few percent of wives earned more than their husbands. Now 1 in 4 do. That's an extraordinary change. I'm often encouraging my wife to be one of those 1 in 4, I'll add. Among African Americans, the rates are higher, in fact. Some studies suggest that African American wives earn about as much as husbands do of other races relative to their spouse's income. And this is a promising development, right? The entry of women into the workforce, women's ability to land professional positions and maintain careers. This is a wonderful development, but the revolution is also incomplete. It's incomplete because our values haven't quite changed as much as we might like to imagine. We still expect women to mother, and we still expect men to work. These expectations shape our lives in ways that help to perpetuate our roles, our very traditional roles. You know, Chris Rock has a joke about walking down the street and you see a homeless family, and he says, "When was the last time you ever heard anybody walk past that family and say, he should leave her?" Right? We expect the man to earn the living, just as we expect the women to take care of the children. Relationships that are formed in a different way, that are built on a different model, are still, to a greater extent than we sometimes acknowledge, swimming against the cultural tide. They're fighting expectations. But we're moving in the right direction. And we hope, or I might expect, that actually this development is going to be facilitated, not only by law and public policy, but also by the advent of same-sex marriage, frankly. One of the benefits of same-sex marriage is that same-sex marriage is going to give us a little nudge to move beyond the traditional gender roles that we've long relied on. And finally, third story is a story about increasing interracial marriage. Now here again, we've seen great social change. Prior to the Supreme Court's 1967 decision in Levin v. Virginia, many states made it criminal for a couple to wed across racial lines. Some states criminalized sexual activity across racial lines. And these prohibitions were vigorously enforced. I know they were enforced because they were enforced in my own family. You see, my grandfather was a product of an interracial relationship. He was born years ago in Alabama to a white mother and a black father. Town folk didn't like that, so much so that, as family lore has it, he was placed in a shoebox, sent to live with relatives in another state, only to return several years later once it became clear that his life was no longer in danger. His father was a man who had to leave town, never to be heard from again. To this day, we don't know what became of him. Such was the stigma associated with an interracial relationship in Alabama. Now, that history seems like a long time ago as well. Now, 1 in 6 marriages is interracial. That's a good thing, a promising development. The puzzle here, this is the one I'll leave you with, the puzzle here is why don't black women intermarry more than they do? Black women are the least likely of any group to marry a partner of another race. They're only about half as likely as black men to wed across racial lines. They're only about a third as likely as Asian Americans or Latinos to wed across group lines. This despite the fact that there's unquestionably a shortage of potential partners for black women, given the struggles of black men. So what gives? Well, there are lots of reasons. People have preferences that are not idiosyncratic. There is still in our society a hierarchy based on race, and we see this in people's intimate relationships, perhaps more than elsewhere. And black women have preferences too. Complicated preferences that lead many of them not to want to have a relationship with a man who's not African American. Sometimes those desires to avoid a relationship are based on what might seem like simple things. I've talked to women around the country about this, and one of the issues that came up again and again and again, one to which I could not at all relate, involved hair. Black women told me time and again that they didn't want to have to explain to a man who wasn't black all the things they did with their hair. One woman said she dated an Asian man, and he asked her one night as she was putting on a scarf before bed, he looked at her and he said, "What are you doing?" And she looked at him and said, knowing this was the problem, she said, "Hon, let's have a little talk." She explained, "I cover my hair at night every night." To his puzzled why, she responded, "Because if I don't, it's all over my head and I don't know what to do with it." He understood and he was empathetic. But for this woman and for many others, just the thought of having the hair conversation leaves them tired. And that's one issue of many. The final issue, though, the big one that comes up a lot, is more primal. It's really a fear. It's a fear of familial rejection based on a history that might seem distant once again, but that also is very present in many people's minds. This history is in my own family, I should say. My parents are both deceased. They came up to Cleveland from Alabama and Georgia. The common lore is that people left looking for jobs and opportunity. But the reality for my family and for many others was not quite so positive. You see, when my father came to Cleveland, it was because his brother, his big brother, made the mistake one day of wearing a new suit into town. In a little small town in Georgia, he wore a new suit into town, which was met with the response of, "Nigger, do you think you better than us?" One thing led to another. My father recalls carrying the shells for the shotgun that his brother used to keep the mob at bay that was gathering around their house. Before the sun came up the next morning, my Uncle Rufus was on the train to Cleveland, and the rest of the family soon followed. This was in a little town in Georgia. Such was the leaving that my father never went back, and I've never been there. They left that behind, but that memory stayed with them. That memory is just one example of the ways in which the history and the context shapes our decisions, even those that might seem to be the most personal and the most intimate. Thank you.